Okay, here we are. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. All right. So today we're talking about social and economic diversity. And we're talking about largely cultural differences for sure, but really a lot of these issues are sort of tied up in either actual poverty or impoverished beliefs that we hold about people who are culturally different than we are. So let's just start first at the very top of the um, iceberg, as it were, and just sort of talk about culture. So we already in this class discussed culture as, and we used the analogy of Google Earth and sort of moving in and out at the Google Earth at every level, and there's culture at every level. So a lot of those things that we talked about as cultural commitments, the different levels, like at the neighborhood level, the city level, the country level, are things that are perhaps sometimes at the very tip of the iceberg. So when we talk about what people wear or the holidays that they have or um, customs around how they greet each other or the symbol systems that they use, like if they have a different alphabet or something like that, those are really what we call visible culture, the things that you can see. But it's the least of the true impact of culture. So much more of culture is underneath the water, as it were, in this example, right? The stuff that's invisible, unstated, worldviews about there's sort of the classic East-West worldview division, right? On the one hand, Western culture is very individualistic. Eastern culture is very collectivistic. That's a worldview. It has a big impact on everything that we do. And yet there's not something you can point at like, look at that hat that they're wearing. That's proof that they are holding this worldview. It's invisible, but it's really powerful. Similarly, attitudes and like views towards things like um, in Latin cultures, in many Latin cultures, they're very the views held about marriage and family and abortion and um, homosexuality are all pretty conservative. Those are attitudes based on assumptions that come from being a Christian country. So those attitudes and those assumptions, we can describe them and we can all sort of agree on them, but they're not visible to the eye. You don't see somebody and immediately say like, "Oh, I see you hold conservative values around abortion." That's not how it works. And yet, the way that you view abortion and the way that you view family values and the way that you view marriage and all of those things have huge impacts on the way that life um, plays out for you. Values, beliefs, perceptions, all the same kind of thing. So when we think about culture, often in schools, when we talk about like having a multicultural day or something like that, it's often the case that what we're talking about, we're usually talking about things that are um, visible, right? So in schools, we're like multicultural day. Let's everybody bring some food. Everybody dress in the way you would in your culture. Everybody bring an artifact. Everybody share their language, and those are all really valuable. Like kids understand culture in terms of what's visible as well. But it's also really important as teachers that we are able to see the deeper part of culture that is fit into beliefs and values and perceptions and assumptions as well. Um, so when we think about culture, we need to make sure that we're thinking about something that is deep and wide. Because if you recall, culture is what the one definition of culture, another definition of culture, other than this one, which is about what's above and what's below in terms of visible and invisible culture, or this one that's more about demographics, regional, ethnic, religious, racial, gender, social class, and other lines. Another way to think about culture is the ways in which we apply meaning to things. So when you say this, it means that. When I say welcome, it means something, and the something that it means is defined by culture. So as we're thinking about culture, it's worth making sure that we're broadening our perspective. Now, when you think about culture, it's important that you are walking a clear, like you're going to make some missteps. That's just how it goes. But it's important that you make an effort to walk the line between stereotyping, which is assuming that somebody matches your understanding of their cultural values, with having cultural sensitivity. You unfortunately can't opt out of this, right? Like you can't say like, oh, like declare yourself like culture blind, right? Oh, I treat everyone as humans. It just, that's not a good strategy, because there are things that come along with culture and economic diversity and racial issues and all of that that need to be acknowledged and seen. So you do need to make an effort to be culturally sensitive. And you just have to recognize that that's always in tension with the notion of stereotyping. That, people, not just children, but people are really complex. And when you focus in on one variable at a time, like, right, now we're going to look at your social class or your ethnicity or your race or your gender, we can miss the way that those things are interacting. So, one classic case of interacting variables in a person's life is what they call intersectionality, which is where you hold, often when they're talking about intersectionality, they're talking about um, when you are a minority group in two ways. And by minority, I mean minority in power, not so much minority in numbers. So, if you're Black and a woman, you have intersectionality in that you're getting some of the struggle of being a woman combined with the struggle of being Black, and there's an additional struggle that comes from being both Black and a woman. And people talk about intersectionality at every intersection, right? So there's something about being, I mean, it's not always just, the intersectionality is not only clearly people who are in sort of minority power positions. There's a lot of talk about intersectionality about being a man and Black. Like a Black man means more than being Black, means more than being a man. There's an additional sort of part that comes from being a Black man. So any two demographics you put together, you hit on something that feels slightly different, and that's that feeling in that in the overlappingness that's called intersectionality. And intersectionality needs to just be understood. It needs to be understood as a part of the life that your students and you are living. We all have things that are intersecting with each other, that you just have to be aware of how it's affecting you as a teacher in the classroom and how it's affecting your students that you're teaching. So it's important that we're culturally sensitive and that we have understanding of intersectionality, but we also need to always keep our eye on the fact that there's complexity here, that children are complex, and that sometimes when you look at just one piece, you're missing the larger picture, but also that being a member of a group, being a woman, doesn't necessarily mean that you have that you feel like you're impacted by um, the struggles of being a woman. So there are women who do not feel burdened by a lack of access to higher levels of management. That's one of the things that they talk about with like the glass ceiling for women. It's hard to be a woman because no one will give you an opportunity because you've got children. There's like a lot to it. There's a lot to the way they talk about how gender impacts women in the workforce. And there are some women who don't feel it. So when somebody is trying to like talk to them and connect with them about where they're at, like they're assuming a lot about that woman, telling stories that, that woman is supposed to connect with, but she doesn't. And no matter who you're looking at and what variable you're trying to meet them on, there will always be people who are like, why are you talking to me like that? Why are you, if you're trying to help women or young girls to have confidence in science, and you're talking to a girl and you're saying, and don't worry, doing science isn't as hard as it seems. Like, and the girls like had never had a problem with doing science and thinks you're being kind of an ass, right? That's the kind of thing we have to be careful about. We need to be sensitive and aware that there are patterns in the way things play out, but we also just have to always remember that individual people, some have really intense experiences like that, and some do not have those experiences. So there are lots of missteps that you'll likely make as you're trying to walk this line, because it's a difficult one to walk. And what I find most helpful in this is to always return to the individual. Know what you might think is going on, but always check to make sure that that's a reality for this person. A good example of this is if somebody says that they're from the Bronx, and then you immediately have all of these beliefs about what it means to be from the Bronx. And so now you're trying to like connect with them about, living in poverty, and there being a lot of um, projects, and the schools are under-resourced, and all of that is generally true of the Bronx, but it is not true of every single person who lives in the Bronx or every neighborhood in the Bronx. In fact, there are some really, really nice neighborhoods in the Bronx that have, just normal levels of poverty. It's not, like there's not intense poverty in that part of the Bronx. And so you want to be sure that you don't just assume that because you have a piece of information about somebody or their life, that you now are able to connect with them, because that might not have the impact that you think it should have. So again, this is just about walking that line between stereotyping and cultural sensitivity. It's not like I've got a tip for you and now you're going to do it perfectly. Instead, this is a matter of wading into the water so that you can meet people where they're at, and then just walking the line, overstepping it in this direction and then overstepping it in that direction. But always generally, getting clearer about who the people are in your class and what their individual circumstances are, while still being informed by what you understand about cultural differences. So that's important when anytime we're talking about any of these issues, culture, demographics, social, racial, ethnic issues, all of them. So now we're going to talk about a specific issue that has a huge impact on students' abilities to learn in the classroom, and that is income inequality, and particularly poverty. So since most of you are likely to be teachers in New York City public schools, it's worth understanding what kind of income inequality we're dealing with in New York City. Now, New York City is one of the most segregated school districts in the country, and that's largely because of neighborhoods having really different costs of living. Like, cost of living in New York City is very high, but cost of living in some neighborhoods in New York City is like ridiculously high. So anything here that's in yellow probably has a very high cost of living. So with the exception of Staten Island, that one has like a different set of sort of economic indicators. But you'll see, like, here we are in Manhattan, right? Like these have lower poverty levels. And this Manhattan goes all the way up here, of course, you guys know that. So like the lower part of Manhattan, this is probably 96th Street right here. So these bright yellow areas have lower economic indicators of need. Only half the students need free and reduced lunch in Manhattan, versus 88 to 92%, this dark blue. Here's a little, this is probably Bushwick. Here's up here in the Bronx. It's where you expect it to be, right? So there are parts, but not all of the Bronx. Look, this up here is a part of the Bronx near Westchester that is actually not any more impoverished than most of Brooklyn. So that just sort of drives home what we were talking about a minute ago about the Bronx. So anyways, you're looking here at a range between 45% of students needing free and reduced lunch up to 92% of students needing free and reduced lunch. And when you look at the map, the darker the blue, the more economic need there is. Now, for contrast, this is a very, our New York City public schools are pretty like high need. The vast majority of students, the average is 80%. 80% of students in New York City need economic support. They need free and reduced lunch. They need programs. They need supports in the classroom to counteract the high levels of poverty in the schools. And for contrast, only less than 10% of students in Westchester, as a county, right? Westchester's a county. Only less than 10% of Westchester students need free and reduced lunch, compared to the Manhattan, which is 45 to 52%. And Essex County, New Jersey, which is just due west, it's actually right here. It includes both Montclair and Newark. You can kind of see my little mouse moving around here. But it includes Newark, has almost 17% free and reduced lunch. So, I mean, that's pretty high compared to many, many suburban school districts. And I think that's because it includes the city of Newark. But it's nowhere near the lowest level of poverty in New York City, which is Manhattan, 45 to 52%. So New York City has high economic need. And what that means is, as teachers, you're going to have to know a lot about what it's like to educate students who live in poverty, and think about how you can structure your classroom and your learning experiences and your supports to parents and your routines to support students who have high economic need. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So poverty and school achievement have a very, very close relationship. The more impoverished you are and the longer you are impoverished, so the poorer you are, the less money you have, and separately, the longer you are in poverty. Both of those have independent contributions to the impact that poverty has on academic achievement. And of course, we're living during a time of great economic divisions. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And over time, you are seeing an increase in the gap between the academic achievement of students who are privileged and those who are in poverty. So what you're looking at here is just one snapshot in a moment in time. And these are ACT scores broken out by socioeconomic status, which is poverty. Well, it's like you can have high SES, which means you have no poverty, or you can have low SES, which means you have a lot of poverty. So, and without fail, of course, those who are privileged have higher percentages of college readiness. So college readiness is like being on grade level, but for the ACTs. Like, are you ready for college? Sort of just the threshold. 64% of resourced students are ready for college, whereas 44% of students in poverty are ready for college, which is not many. And of course, that goes all the way down to when you look at, like, are you ready for English, reading, math, and science? Only 11% of students in poverty are ready for all four, which is about a third of students who are resourced, 28%. So there's a strong relationship between poverty and academic achievement. So it's something we need to pay close attention to. And of course, homelessness is what we would call extreme poverty, which is where the student has food insecurity, housing insecurity, transient lifestyle. And New York City has a growing homelessness problem. What you're looking at here is a figure that actually only goes up to 2013, 2014, this year. But from when the coronavirus hit, people started talking about how many homeless students there are in New York City public schools. So there were 83,413 in 2013, 2014, school year 13-14, which is, we're in school year 19-20 now. So we're 6 years ahead. And in those 6 years, you can see that this homelessness problem in New York City has gotten worse. So we went from 83,000 in 13-14 to 114,000 in 19-20. 114,000 is the population of some cities. And it is the population of homeless students, not homeless people, homeless New York City public students in 2020. Just going to move this back. There we This is a big problem. And if you're teaching in the New York City public schools, you're likely to be faced with it. There will almost certainly be students who are homeless in your classrooms. Um, and homelessness is actually a growing problem across the country. And it's because of this growing income divide. The opportunity to improve your economic situation is just harder to come by. As poor people get deeper and deeper entrenched in poverty and rich people gather more of the communal wealth for themselves, um, homelessness goes up across the country. There are 37 states where up to a quarter of their public school students are homeless. And it has a huge impact on, of course, your physical health, because what are you eating? Where are you sleeping? What kind of exercise are you getting? Like, are you warm? Like, do you have what you need? No, we don't. But not just that, there's social interactions that you're missing or getting exposed to that are not helpful. And learning disabilities that are usually undiagnosed, because who's taken the kid to the hospital to get evaluated for dyslexia or ADHD or any of the depression, anxiety, any of the things that are certainly happening in the homeless population. When you are homeless, you are very unlikely to perform at grade level. 75% of elementary school students who are homeless perform below grade level, and it gets worse in high school by an additional 10%. Now, when you look at proficiency, and this is on ELA and math proficiency on 8th grade tests. So it's just like, look at the blue and compare the blue to the orange and yellow. So the light blue is ELA, the dark blue is math, the light yellow is ELA, and the orange or red or whatever this is the math. So over time, there's been a little bit of a decline regardless, right? From school year 2012 to 2013, all the way up through 15, 16, there was a decline overall over time. But the difference between resourced students and students in poverty, or homeless students in extreme poverty, is different, right? They are just, their entire, this, like, if you look at this red line here and this blue line, they actually track pretty well, right? Like, if you were to just slide them together, they would overlap. But the blue line is sitting between 76% and 60% who are at grade level. And the red line is running from 35% to 30% at grade level. So the slopes are basically the same, but the homeless kids are playing out at 40% less proficiency. So homelessness and poverty more generally has a huge impact on students. Now, as we move forward in time, they say that 1 in 7 New York City public school students will be homeless at one point during elementary school. That's astounding. And again, is very likely to impact you in your classroom. And if you are homeless, it means that you've lived in at least 2 housing settings during elementary school, which means you've moved around a lot. And that's at least 2. Some kids are moving around daily. They're moving from this family member to that family member to the shelter, then their mom has a place, and then they're back out, you know? And that, all that moving around results in a lot of transfers. So they're often transferred mid-year, at least twice. If you were homeless, then you were transferred school mid-year at least twice, which is also very disruptive for the students' learning. And they're likely over the course of elementary school to miss 88 days of school, which is itself half a school year. So they might be in 6th grade, but they've had 5, like they've got through 5/5 and a half, because they've missed an entire half of a school year. And it's not like they missed it all at the same time. They miss like ranges of school days, like 3 or 4, 5, 6, 2 weeks a month of school at a time when something disruptive happens, like maybe they move houses and maybe for a while they don't have anywhere to be, and then finally they land at grandma's house, and then they go to school near grandma's house. Well, the time it took them to move from this house to that house and around and about was 3 weeks, and they missed 3 weeks of school at that time in the middle of the school year, which is difficult to come back from. And that kind of difficulty and that kind of disjointedness and that kind of lack of continuity results in more discipline for the students. Um, Obviously, if they're struggling because they missed a lot of school, they could easily be held back a grade, which itself has risk factors to it. And like we said, they have half the proficiency of their resourced peers, meaning that their resource peers might get, let's say that they got a 515 and they would have, a scaled score that was half that. And that's a problem. Like, that's a long-term problem. And it's all not because of their intelligence and their motivation, their interest. It's just because of poverty. So what is it about poverty that gives it such an enormous effect on education? And the thing about poverty is that it tends to be a lifelong problem, which isn't to say that people who are in poverty stay in poverty, like especially kids who become adults. There's a lot of opportunity, less than there was, but there is a lot of opportunity to move out of poverty through education and job training and their programs and stuff. But poverty is like a long-term problem in people's lives. That starts even before you're born. So if you have a mother living in poverty who's pregnant, it's likely she'll have poor prenatal and infant health care, right? So maybe the nutrition's not that great. Because they're not getting good prenatal infant health care, they might have a lot of premature births, which brings you into life with cognitive and learning problems. Poverty tends to go hand in hand with drug and alcohol abuse, and that can be happening at the same time. Which can cause cognitive delays and attentional problems and language problems in the child. And then there's just that life is very stressful when you are in poverty. There's evictions and hunger and lack of resources, and all of that stuff causes this just feeling of chronic stress, which makes it difficult for the student to focus, get their work done, finish their projects, stay on top of their lives. And often the low income housing has more problems, right? Like, it's got toxins and asbestos and lead and rats and rat poison, and like the environmental toxins associated with impoverished living are also associated with neurological impairments. So there are just circumstances of life in poverty that make thinking and learning and growing and doing your schoolwork much, much harder. And then the student arrives at school and there are assumptions that show up. So even if that child had good prenatal health care, has no cognitive deficits, was not exposed to toxins, mom wasn't using drugs while pregnant or in early life. When you show up at school poor, wearing ratty clothes, maybe not as well taken care of, maybe really hungry, teachers tend to stigmatize you, as do the other students, and they have very negative expectations of you, really low expectations. And when teachers have low expectations, they don't call on you, they set lower standards for you. And then when a student who's poor turns in work that's substandard, they're like, okay, sure, whatever, fine, thanks. Right? Like, there's no feeling. I mean, let's say that the person's not a jerk and they're just like, oh, thank you. Like, I know it was hard for you to get this done, so I'll just take it and I won't ask you to redo it because I know it was really hard for you to even just get this far. That they call those the tyranny of low expectations. When you have really low expectations of a student, it's hard for them to overcome your low expectations. They're going to meet your low expectations. Those lower quality experiences create lower academic self-concept, and it creates sort of learned helplessness. School does not feel like a place of opportunity. And then there are chronic inequalities that come along with racial differences. And then you get an intersectionality problem where if you're impoverished and you're of a racial group that has chronic inequalities, then you have the additional problem of being poor and Black, or poor and Hispanic, or whatever, whichever And then you, of course, you could have a multiple intersectionality and be poor and Black and a woman. And each of those has an independent contribution to the struggle. And then there's the intersectionality contribution as well. So it's important for us to just realize how poverty plays out and interacts with other pieces. So when you have resources, you are more likely to attend college. And that's a lot goes in to being ready to attend college. You have supports along the way. You have a belief that college is affordable or doable given, scholarships and stuff. And when you are in a school where other people have middle to high income families, even the students who are in poverty are more likely to go to college, because there's something about being surrounded by people that think college is a natural, normal thing and everyone's doing it. It carries you along. So having heterogeneous schools where there's income diversity is important for all of the students. Because students who are in only high poverty schools, like high density poverty schools, are seeing a lot of their friends drop out, a lot of their friends, resisting school achievement, having a lot of discipline problems, trying not to act white, or as it says here, acting middle class. All of those pressures push down on even students who want to go to college. They stop believing, they stop seeing it as something that they would do. So educators need to be equity literate, which just means you have to understand what it's like to be poor. And try to understand the lives of your students and make sure you're really holding some high standards for them, and make school a place where your economic standing is not doesn't impact the way that teachers are treating you, and work hard with anti-bullying programs and stuff like that to make sure that it doesn't impact the way that the students treat each other either. So when we're trying to understand what is the mechanism of poverty, it comes down to lack of access to high quality preschool, greater academic setbacks from summer breaks. These are just some more variables that impact the way that poverty impacts your academic achievement. And one of those is tracking in lower quality schools, meaning that sometimes even when poor kids go to wealthy schools or like middle income schools, the poor kids are tracked into groups where they have lower expectations, less opportunity. That's called tracking, and that's a problem. But of course, you could also be in a lower quality school and not have access to those resources as well. All right, so when we're teaching kids in poverty, it's important that we do these things. Set, maintain high expectations for our students. That is the number one thing. Try not to assume. As soon as you start feeling sorry and, oh gosh, I wish I could fix your life, as soon as you start having those kind of deficit thoughts, you need to pull back and not make excuses for the student, not expect less for them, certainly be empathetic and understanding, but remember that your job as their teacher is to hold high expectations for them. And holding high expectations is the most caring thing you can do as a teacher for your students. You can, of course, in class, you hold them to the same exact expectations, and outside of class, you can have caring conversations. You can attend their sports events and cheer them on. You can mention that you miss them in class when they're not there and make them feel like they belong. Students in poverty need additional direct supports around learning strategies and self-regulation skills. So students from resourced families, the parents play a role in creating motivation and self-regulation. when the environment that you're in is chaotic, you have less supports around that. So as a teacher, that's something that you can provide additional supports around. Also, help the student pay attention to health problems, absences, and tardies. Like, watch them, pay attention to them, notice when they're not there. It will help them feel like they belong at home, and that's especially important if they're in transitional, you have a transitional life with your family, like if there is some homelessness or even just some transitional, like always moving, even though they've never really been homeless, but they move from place to place because they're trying to make it work. Someone who notices that they're not there, knows about their life, asks them questions, checks in on them when they're absent, that's important. It helps the students a lot. And make sure that you're staying on top of their knowledge so that you can meet them in their ZPD and build on what they know. Now, just one final comment here, which is that we often talk, when we talk about socioeconomic status or poverty or a lack of resources, it often gets conflated with race. And that is because the two are conflated, meaning that racial differences tend to coincide with economic differences. It's like some of it's causal and some of it's historical, and who knows why, but they do tend to go, they tend to fluctuate together. But it's very important that you, remember we were talking earlier about the line between cultural sensitivity and stereotyping. This is one place that you do need to be careful. Not all white students have resources. There are poor white students. And not all Black and brown students are poor. Lots of them have resourced families and invested parents and interests in, things that, your expectations might be surprised. And so it's very important that you don't conflate them. Recognize that they tend to go together, but always recognize that that talking about economic need is not the same as talking about race. They're not the same thing. And there's some sense that while the income gap between high and low people, that gap is growing drastically, that poor people are poorer and rich people are richer, and the gap between them is massive and growing. That's this black line here. We are seeing some bit historically of a decrease in the gap based on race, meaning that back in people who were born, though this is really historical data, right? Like we're going back pretty far. We talk about 1955, that's when this cohort was born. There was now, like the way we talk about income inequality is how it was the massiveness of the gap for those who are racially different, right? Like race predicted massive gaps in achievement. The way that income produces massive gaps in achievement now. But over time, the gap between Black and brown students and white students has gone down significantly, meaning that there's less of a gap in achievement based on race. So that just helps us to see, I mean, obviously things are not perfect, but it just helps us to see that race and socioeconomic status, or poverty basically, aren't the same thing. That actually the poverty problem is getting worse and the race problem in terms of achievement gaps, not in terms of everything, but in terms of achievement gaps, is actually narrowing. So just like a little bit of a throwback to the original point of like, you can understand how things tend to go, but you still need to check in with each individual person and make sure that their individual circumstances follow the pattern before you assume. So what I want you to do for your little essay for this week is I want you to go on, just write a little 2-paragraph essay about what routine supports. Like, how can you support students in your class who are living in poverty? So if you go back to this slide, what are the problems? in the schools. So poverty impacts students' achievement because of teacher expectations, stigmatization, lower educational experiences, low academic self-concept. There's some, oh, I think they're celebrating the hospital near our house. Tracking, fewer resourced, inexperienced teachers. Look through these slides about why does poverty have such a huge impact? And then ask yourself the question, what kinds of routines, what kinds of supports, like what can I do? You cannot make someone not poor. You cannot interrupt the fact that they are in fact poor, that they don't have resources, that they're homeless. You can't change the fact that they're homeless. You just cannot. But what can you do? What routine supports can you provide for the students in your class that gives that sort of additional support to the students who are living in poverty? So write that essay and I will see it, and I'll see you all in class on Thursday.